Before we begin, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Whether you are sitting on a porch in Tennessee, wrapped in a quilt out in Montana, or maybe somewhere cold with a hot cup of coffee in your hands, I want to know. Every single comment matters to me. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story. We put out new videos every single week, and every one of them is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends. Now, let's talk about a woman named Nora Callahan. And the morning she stood in a doorway, she had no business standing in, looking at a room that held a secret she was never meant to find. She did not know yet what the room meant. She only knew that the door had blown open in the night, and the man whose house this was had never once told her it existed. That was 3 months into her life at Iron Bell Ranch. This is the story of how she got there. The rejection notices came in small envelopes. Nora Callahan had learned to recognize them by the particular lightness of a single folded page inside a government issue envelope, the kind the St. Louis Placement Agency used for all its correspondence, formal and otherwise. She could feel the difference between a rejection and something else before she opened the seal. A rejection was always light, always exactly one page. She kept them in a cigar box on the shelf above her small desk in Abilene, Kansas, lined up by date, each one a precise record of a door that had opened just far enough for her to see the light inside before closing again. By the autumn of 1885, there were 9 of them. 9 letters informing her in the careful and apologetic language of an agency that had built an entire vocabulary around delivering bad news gracefully, that a prospective gentleman had reviewed her particulars and decided to pursue a different match. The language was always measured, always kind in the impersonal way that form letters are kind when the person writing them has never met you and is not required to think of you as a specific human being. She had read each one carefully the first time and not at all after that. She kept them because she believed in keeping evidence of things she had survived. She was 37 years old. She was not a small woman. She was the kind of woman whose size had always been a fact of the room before anything else, broad through the shoulder, wide through the hip, built in the particular way of women who had worked physically for most of their lives and had the body to show for it. Her hands were rough at the knuckle and dark at the nail bed from years of garden work and kitchen work in the particular kind of labor that doesn't stop because someone has declared it a holiday. Her face was honest, not beautiful. She had never been beautiful, had known since she was a girl that beauty was not going to be the thing she led with, but honest, the kind of face that told you something true about the person behind it. Her husband, Thomas Callahan, had called her face honest. He had meant it as a compliment, and she had taken it as one. Thomas had been a good man, steady and practical, and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way of men who have seen a fair amount of difficulty and come out the other side with most of their sense of humor intact. He had worked the copper mines outside Abilene for 11 years and died in a collapse 5 years ago at 42 in the company of 2 other men whose wives had stood on the same ground where Nora had stood and felt the same thing she had felt, the particular silence that comes after you understand that the thing you had been afraid of has gone ahead and happened. She had managed since. That was what she did. She managed. She had stayed in Abilene because it was where she was, and because moving required a destination, and she had not had one. She had taken in mending. She had kept a kitchen garden and sold the surplus at the market on Thursdays. She had for a year and a half kept the books for a dry goods merchant named Halpern, who paid her modestly and never questioned her arithmetic because her arithmetic was always right. She had kept herself alive and solvent and reasonably dignified, and she had done it without asking anyone for more than she was owed. What she had not done was found a reason to stay. That was the thing she was beginning to understand in the autumn of her 36th year, and into her 37th, she was not living in Abilene because it was right for her. She was living there because she had not yet found the place that was. There was a difference. She had spent a long time telling herself otherwise, but she was not a woman who could sustain a comfortable lie for very long. She was too honest for it. Her face had always given her away. She had written to the St. Louis Placement Agency in January of 1885. She had filled out her particulars with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Age 37, height 5 feet 3, build substantial, skills, cooking, preserving, baking, canning, household management, bookkeeping, garden cultivation, basic livestock care, health excellent, education adequate, temperament steady, previous marriage, yes, widowed, children, none. She had not softened anything. She was not young, and she was not slim, and she was not particularly pretty, and she had lived long enough to understand that the women who presented themselves as something other than what they were ended up in arrangements that suited neither party. She would rather be passed over honestly than accepted under false pretenses. She had been passed over honestly 9 times. She had not yet been accepted any way at all. The 10th letter from the agency was heavier than the rest. She knew when she picked it up. Something different in the weight, not a single folded page, but 2, maybe 3, and something small and hard inside the envelope that clinked very faintly when she turned it over. She stood at her small desk for a moment before opening it, one hand flat on the envelope, the way a person might pause before opening a door. They are not sure what they will find behind. A Mr. Wade Callister of Bitterroot County, Montana Territory was seeking a capable woman to serve as wife and household manager on his cattle ranch. He was 54 years of age, a widower, no children surviving. He owned a property called Iron Bell Ranch, some 14,000 acres northeast of a town called Garnett in the Western Territories. He was not, the agency notice was careful to say, looking for a romantic arrangement. He was looking for a practical one. Someone capable of managing a working ranch household, overseeing food stores, supervising kitchen operations, and managing the domestic requirements of a cattle operation. The small, hard thing inside the envelope was a pressed sprig of something dried and flat dark green going to gray. She didn't recognize it at first. Then she understood it was sage, Montana sage. She had no idea why he had included it. She didn't think he knew why either. But she held it between her fingers and smelled it dry and faintly bitter and immeasurably Western, and she thought, well, she sat with the notice for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she wrote back and said she was interested. 3 weeks later, a letter came from Wade Callister himself. It was sparse, fewer than 15 lines. He told her the train fare would be arranged. He told her there would be a room for her at the ranch. He told her the ceremony would be performed within the week of her arrival before a justice of the peace without ceremony. He did not tell her she was his first choice. She had already come to her own conclusions about that. She had been passed over 9 times. She was 37 years old, wide-hipped and rough-handed, and she could cook a meal from almost nothing and keep books to the penny and manage a household that was trying to fall apart. She knew what she was. She also knew what she was not. She was not first-choice material for most men. She had accepted that fact with the same practical calm she brought to most facts, not happily, not without cost, but cleanly. You could not build on a lie. You could only build on what was true, and what was true was that this was her one offer, and she intended to take it. What she had not accounted for was Clara Hess. She met Clara Hess on the 2nd train, somewhere in the long stretch of high country between Billings and the Bitterroot Valley, where the mountains came up on the western side of the car in long, dark walls, and the sky was the particular deep blue that seems to belong exclusively to high altitude. It was November and cold, the kind of cold that came in through the window seals and found the joints of your fingers, and she had been watching the mountains for the better part of an hour when the woman sat down across from her in the empty seat. Clara Hess was somewhere in her late 40s, well-dressed without being extravagant, with a composed face and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to women who have learned through some difficulty or other to keep most of what they are thinking out of their expressions. She had a small valise and a larger trunk in the rack above, and she settled herself with the efficient economy of someone who traveled alone frequently. They did not speak for some time. This suited Nora, who had been comfortable with silence for most of her life and did not feel the need to fill it. It was Clara who spoke first. "You're going to Garnet," she said. Not a question, an observation. Something in Nora's luggage, perhaps, or her bearing. "Near enough," Nora said. "Iron Bell Ranch." The stillness in Clara Hess's face changed very slightly. Something moved behind it that she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "I know it," Clara said. Nora looked at her. "I was there," Clara said after a moment. "Last year, October." The train went around a long curve and the mountains disappeared behind them and then reappeared on the other side, closer now, the snow on their peaks catching the low afternoon light. The car swayed gently. "The agency sent you?" Nora asked. "It did." Clara folded her hands in her lap. She looked at them. "I stayed 2 weeks and then I left." The particular weight of what was not being said settled into the space between them. Why buy? Nora asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment. The ranch is in trouble, she said finally. That part was expected. You'll have read the particulars. She paused. But the trouble with the ranch is not the trouble I mean. Then what do you mean? Clara looked out the window at the mountains going past. There is something wrong with that man, she said. Not cruel. I want to be precise about that. He is not a cruel man. But there is something wrong, something closed off, something that has decided it does not want to be saved. She turned back to face Nora. I am a practical woman. I have no interest in trying to fix something that has made its peace with breaking. The car swayed again. Outside, the light was starting to go gold and long. Nora thought about this. Thank you for telling me, she said. Clara nodded. She opened her valise and took out a book, and she read for the rest of the journey, and neither of them said anything more about Iron Bell Ranch. But Nora sat with what she had been told, turning it over the way she turned over any practical problem from different angles, looking for the shape of it. Something wrong with that man, something that has decided it does not want to be saved. She looked out the window at the darkening Montana landscape, at the enormous and indifferent beauty of it, at the mountains going gray in the last of the light, and she thought, well, she had not come here to save anyone. She had come here because she had nowhere else to be. That was the simple truth of it. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let the train carry her north. Iron Bell Ranch appeared in the late afternoon light of a cold November day, and Nora's first impression was of something large that had given up trying. She had expected neglect. The particulars had prepared her for a household that had fallen behind insufficient staff, a struggling kitchen, the usual domestic deterioration of a property whose owner had been too focused on survival to maintain appearances. She had expected the bones to be good and the surface to be worn. What she had not expected was the particular quality of the neglect. It was not the neglect of a man too busy to attend to his house. It was the neglect of a man who had stopped caring whether his house stood or fell. There was a difference she understood immediately, and the difference was important. One kind of neglect could be fixed with work and time and resources. The other kind was a choice, and a choice, unlike a circumstance, required a different kind of undoing. The main house was impressive in its bones, 2 stories, stone foundation, wide veranda running the full length of the front and face heavy timber construction that spoke of real money spent with real intention sometime in the last 20 years. The barn was large and well-designed. The bunkhouse was solidly built. The outbuildings were numerous and placed with the logical efficiency of someone who had once thought carefully about how a working ranch should be organized. But the veranda railing had come loose in 2 sections and not been replaced. One of the upper windows was boarded over from the inside. The kitchen garden along the eastern wall was not merely overgrown, it had been left entirely uncleared since the last growing season. The dead stalks and the frost-blackened leaves of summer plants lying where they had fallen, not even turned under for compost. Well, the barn doors were plumb and true but unpainted. The whole property had the look of something that had been built by a man who cared deeply and maintained by a man who had stopped. The wagon that had come from Garnet to collect her pulled into the yard, and 3 men looked up from their end-of-day work and then looked away again with the particular incuriosity of people who have been disappointed enough times that they have decided to stop expecting. The man who drove the wagon, a ranch hand named Rex, broad-shouldered and quiet, who had said almost nothing on the drive from town, climbed down and held out a hand to help her down. She accepted it and landed solidly and looked around. A man was coming from the direction of the barn. He was tall, over 6 feet, perhaps an inch more, and built in the way of a man who had worked physically for most of his life and whose body had organized itself around that fact. His hair was dark and heavily silvered, cut short and growing in at the sides from a recent barbering. His face was deeply lined, the kind of lining that comes from decades of outdoor work and weather, from squinting into wind and sun without much thought for the cost of it. He moved with the particular deliberateness of a large man accustomed to his own size, no wasted motion. Nothing hurried, nothing that indicated any feeling about the situation one way or the other. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Callahan," he said. His voice was low, even without notable warmth or notable coldness. The voice of a man who had decided long ago that emotional inflection was an unnecessary expenditure. "Mr. Callister," she said. He looked at her with the frank, assessing look of a man evaluating a practical situation, not unkind, Not rude, but entirely without pretense. He was assessing what he had sent for and what had arrived and whether the two matched. She returned the look with equal directness because she was not the woman who looked away from things. Train was late, he said. By 40 minutes. There was ice on the rails outside Drummond. He nodded once. I'll have Rex take your trunk to the house. I'll show you the kitchen. Not welcome. Not I'm glad you're here. Not the place isn't much, but it's yours now. Just I'll show you the kitchen. Practical. Transactional. The man Clara Hess had described not cruel but something closed off. She followed him. The inside of the house was better than the outside and worse than she had hoped. The entry hall was wide and the ceilings were high and the construction was good. She could see that in the heavy timber framing, in the way the floors were laid, in the solid weight of the interior doors. This had been a fine house once, and not so long ago that the fine parts were invisible. But it had the atmosphere of a place that was being endured rather than inhabited. The furniture was good quality and thick with dust. The floors were swept but not scrubbed. The windows were filmed with the particular gray haze of glass that hasn't been washed in many months. The parlor smelled of old ash and cold air. The rooms had the feeling of spaces that people moved through rather than lived in. He showed her to a bedroom on the ground floor off the back hallway behind the kitchen. Small but private, with a window facing the eastern yard. A narrow iron bed with a clean quilt. A washstand, a braided rug on the plank floor. The kitchen is through there, he said and gestured at the connecting door. She went through it. The kitchen was large, built for a working ranch household at full capacity, the kind of kitchen that expected to feed a dozen men 3 times a day and had been designed accordingly. A good iron range of Monarch solid and heavy, a wide center work table of unpainted pine, scarred from years of use, 2 deep sinks with a hand pump between them, a door at the back that opened to the yard and the cold air beyond, a pantry alcove off to the right. She went to the pantry. What she found there was the truest portrait of Iron Bell Ranch she had encountered yet. Not the broken railing, or the boarded window, or the dead kitchen garden. Those were symptoms. What was in this pantry was the diagnosis. 2 sacks of flour, one of them nearly empty, a half barrel of cornmeal, 3 cans without labels. She shook them. One sounded like beans, the others were a guess. A piece of salt pork cloth wrap that had gone gray at the cut surface. A jar of dried beans, the lid rusting at the ring. Some shriveled, dried chilies hanging from a nail. A single potato in the corner of the bottom shelf, so soft she could push her thumb into it. Salt. That was nearly all. She stood in the pantry for a longer moment. She was not panicking. She was calculating. She came back to the work table. Wade Callister was still in the kitchen door, watching her with an expression that told her very little except that he was watching. When do the men come in for supper? She asked. 6. How many? 3 hands. Myself. 4 total. She looked at the cold range. I'll need the fire built up and someone to show me where the water pump is. Rex knows the pump. The root cellar. Below the barn. Silas has the key. Who's Silas? Eldest hand. He'll be in the bunkhouse. She untied the travel bundle she had packed, knowing she would need it within the first hour. Her apron rolled on top, a small kit of the spices and seasonings she had brought herself because she had learned never to assume. She tied the apron on. He was still watching her from the doorway. I'll get someone to build up the fire, he said. She was already back in the pantry counting. She heard him leave. She did not hear him return. When she turned around, the kitchen was empty, and the range was cold, and she had 4 men to feed in less than 2 hours from almost nothing, and she felt not fear, not despair, but the particular sharp clarity of a problem that is hard and solvable and entirely within the scope of what she knows how to do. She pushed her sleeves up and began. She had fed people on less. That was not a boast, it was simply a fact of her life, the same kind of fact as the gray at her temple and the roughness of her knuckles. She had grown up genuinely poor, the kind of poor where a good cook was not someone with fine ingredients, but someone who understood what could be coaxed from imperfect ones, who could make the last of the flour and the end of the lard into something that fed people and gave them a reason to come to the table. Rex had built up the fire before she could ask him to. She heard the range door, the settling of wood, the change in the quality of the kitchen air as heat began to spread from the iron. He showed her the water pump and the root cellar without ceremony, and then he went back to the yard and she went to work. The root cellar yielded 3 more potatoes that were mostly sound, a handful of dried onions that were still fragrant, a crock of rendered lard, and 2 smoked sausages wrapped in cloth that she unwrapped and smelled carefully before deciding they were still good. Not much. Enough if she was careful and the heat was patient. She made hashed potato and sausage and onion, stretched with the dried chile, and the salt cooked slowly in the lard until the edges of everything had gone crisp and dark, and the whole kitchen smelled of something that had actually been cooked rather than merely heated. She made cornbread from the last of the good flour and the dregs of the cornmeal with enough lard to give it crumb and enough salt to give it flavor. She made strong coffee from a small tin she found behind the salt jar, not much in it, barely enough for a pot, and she made it carefully so it would go as far as possible. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen was warm. The range had been going for nearly 2 hours, and the heat had spread from the kitchen into the back hallway and was beginning to push at the edges of the dining room. The smell of the food had gone out the back door into the yard, and it had, she suspected, gone into the bunkhouse as well, because the 3 hands came in on the dot of 6 with the purposeful attention of men who had been smelling something for the better part of an hour. She had put them together quickly on her walk through the yard. Silas, who was perhaps 60, with a close white beard and a set of eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have watched a great deal and learned to reveal very little. Tommy, perhaps 22, painfully thin and young, in a way that was less about age than about never having had enough of the things that fill a person out, food certainly, but also whatever it is that makes a young person feel like they are standing somewhere solid. And Rex, who had driven the wagon from Garnet, perhaps 35, quiet and self-contained, in the way of a man who carries something heavy and has learned to carry it without letting it show. They sat at the kitchen table without ceremony because there was no dining room set up for regular use. She had assessed that quickly and had the sense to feed them where the heat was. She put food in front of them. She put the cornbread in the center of the table and the hash in a wide iron pan and the coffee in 4 tin cups. She stood at the counter and watched from a polite distance while they ate. Wade Callister sat at the end of the table. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man for whom eating was a function rather than a pleasure, methodical, economical, without comment. He cleaned his plate. The other 3 ate with the concentrated attention of men who were genuinely hungry. Silas, when he had set down his fork, looked up at her from the other end of the table. "First hot meal in some time," he said. His voice was graveled and slow. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll do better tomorrow when I've had a proper look at what's on hand," she said. He nodded as though this was exactly what he had expected her to say. He picked up his coffee and drank it and said nothing more, but there was something in the way he drank it with the particular deliberateness of someone marking a moment that she filed away. Tommy had eaten without saying anything, with the focused silence of a young man who has been hungry often enough that food in front of him demands total concentration. When he finished, he looked up briefly and said "ma'am" in a way that seemed to contain more than the single word, and then he looked at his plate again. Rex said nothing, but he ate everything, and when she set the last of the cornbread in front of him without remark, he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man trying to remember the last time someone had done something without being asked. After the men had gone, Wade sat alone at the end of the table with his second cup of coffee. She was washing the dishes when he spoke. "You brought your own spices." She kept her hands in the wash water. "I've never arrived anywhere with enough in the pantry on the first night." A silence. "The pantry needs restocking," he said. "Urgently," she said. "I'll need to go into Garnet within the next 2 days. And I want to see the root cellar properly in the morning, not just a quick pass. And the smokehouse, if there is one. There is, east of the barn. I want to see it." He drank his coffee. She dried her hands. She turned to face him. He was looking at her the same assessing look as before, but something in it had shifted very slightly. Some small recalculation. She had learned to read that kind of look. It was the look of a person who had set their expectations at one level and was finding them exceeded and didn't quite know what to do with that information. "The ranch has seen better years," he said. "I read the particulars. Reading about it isn't the same as seeing it." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He looked at his coffee cup. Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, but something in that direction. A man not accustomed to being assessed clearly and finding that he has been. "You can manage the household as you see fit," he said finally. "That's what you were brought here to do." She looked at him steadily. "I'll need the household accounts," she said, "and the full financial picture when you're ready to share it. I can't manage what I don't understand." The slight tightening of his expression was immediate and involuntary, the reflex of a man who had been managing a loan for a long time and was not accustomed to being asked about it. "That's not necessary for—" "It is," she said, quietly, without aggression but without yielding either. "I'm your wife, Mr. Callister. If there are reasons I need to plan the household around a restricted budget, I need to know those reasons. I'll find them out eventually regardless. Better to start with the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without difficulty. Then he stood, picked up his cup, and walked to the kitchen doorway. He stopped with his back to her. "Come to the office tomorrow morning," he said, "after breakfast." He left. She hung her apron on the hook by the range and went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put her hands in her lap. Through the connecting door, she could hear the kitchen settling, the range ticking. As it cooled, the sound of wind working at the back door, the particular quiet of a house that has had a fire lit in it after a long time without one. She had been chosen last. She was here. She thought about what Clara Hess had said on the train, something that has decided it does not want to be saved. She thought about the way the house looked, not the neglect of difficulty, but the neglect of decision. She thought about the way Wade Callister had said, "That's what you were brought here to do," and how those words had the quality of something said by a man who believed at some level that purpose was what you assigned to other people rather than something you claimed for yourself. She lay down on the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the Montana wind find the gaps in the walls and come through them, patient and cold and entirely indifferent. And she thought, well, whatever he has decided, he has not consulted me about it. She closed her eyes. She was not going anywhere. The ceremony was performed 3 days after her arrival before a justice of the peace in the town of Garnett on a cold Wednesday morning that smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. Silas and a woman named Bess Harmon, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and seemed to know Wade with the careful distance of someone who had given up expecting things from him, stood as witnesses. The ceremony took 9 minutes. Wade shook Nora's hand afterward, which she found both formally strange and somehow completely appropriate. It told her more clearly than anything else could have exactly what kind of arrangement she had entered into. He gave her a ring, plain gold, his mother's, he said without ceremony, looking at the wall behind her as he said it. She put it on, and it fit well enough. And they drove back to Iron Bell in the wagon with the snow beginning to come in from the northwest in thin gray curtains, and neither of them said much of anything. And she thought, this is what a foundation looks like. Not beautiful, not promising anything, just solid. You built on foundations. She had come here to build. She was up before dawn the next morning. She had always been an early riser, not from discipline, but from preference. The dark hours before the house woke were hers alone, and she had learned long ago that solitude was easiest to find before the world had remembered to start. She lit the kitchen lamp and built up the range fire with the efficient movements of a woman who has done it so many times the motion has become part of her body rather than a thought, and put water on to boil, and stood in the warming kitchen in the particular deep quiet of a place where everyone is still asleep. She thought about what she had seen so far. The pantry, the root cellar. She had done a full inventory the morning after her arrival, and what she had found had confirmed what the pantry had already told her. Sparse. The smokehouse had been unused for at least a full season, the hooks empty, the fire pit cold and deep with ash. The kitchen garden was dead. The bunkhouse had extra blankets she had counted in a chest in the hallway. She had already redistributed them, one per man, without asking anyone's permission. She had made a list in her notebook, which she had hung on a nail beside the pantry door, and the list was long and factual and not particularly encouraging. But the bones were good. She had already determined that. The bones of this place, the structure, the outbuildings, the land she could see from the kitchen window in the early light, rolling and vast and covered now in the first thin snow of the season, were good. What surrounded those bones was bad and getting worse. But bone was bone. You could build on bone. She poured her coffee and made a second list in her head, what was needed in what order at what cost. She was good at this. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life accounting for the difference between what was necessary and what was merely useful, between what could wait and what could not. She brought the same precision to it here that she brought to everything. Then she went to find Wade. He was in the office when she came to it after breakfast, a room off the back of the parlor that smelled of old tobacco and leather, and the particular mustiness of papers that had been handled and rehandled and never properly filed. He was at the desk with papers spread in front of him and his hands flat on the surface, in the expression of a man who has read the same columns of figures enough times to have them memorized and has not found the memorizing any more encouraging than the first reading. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Sit down," he said, not a pleasantry, an accommodation. She sat. She did not wait for him to bring up the finances. She asked for them directly in the same tone she had used the first night in the kitchen, not demanding, not aggressive, but clear and without apology. She was his wife. She was managing his household. She needed the full picture. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed the papers toward her without a word. She read for half an hour. She had no formal training in accounting, but she had managed a household budget for years on almost nothing. And she understood numbers in the way of a woman for whom numbers had always been the difference between eating and not. She followed the columns with her finger moving slowly, reading the story that the numbers told. It was not a good story. Iron Bell Ranch had been at some point in the recent past a substantial operation. 14,000 acres with a working herd of several hundred head contracts, with 3 rail buyers, a reputation in Bitterroot County that had been built over 2 decades. Then 3 bad years in a row. A drought that had cut the grazing. A cattle disease that had moved through the herd one summer and taken nearly a third of it. A legal dispute over a water easement on the eastern boundary that had been resolved in Wade's favor, but at a cost that had wiped out most of the operating reserve. A loan from the Territorial Bank secured against the property. And then this was where the numbers became strange, a year in which the operating losses were not explained by any of the recorded circumstances. Not drought, not disease, not legal fees. Just a year in which Wade Callister appeared to have simply stopped attending to his ranch. She looked at the dates. That year was 3 years ago. She set the papers down. She looked at the margins where he had been doing his own calculations, trying different approaches, different scenarios. A man who understood the problem completely and had not been able to solve it. "How many hands 3 years ago?" she asked. 12, he said. "Now 3. She folded her hands on the desk. "The banknote," she said. "Due in the spring." He said it flatly. "I have been attempting to arrange the sale of the eastern parcel, 2,000 acres, the disputed water section. There is a buyer who has expressed interest. He has not committed. And if he doesn't, the bank takes the property." He looked at the papers. All of it. She sat with that. 14,000 acres. The house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the empty smokehouse, the dead kitchen garden. Silas and Tommy and Rex. Wade Callister's 20 years of work and 1 year of unaccounted for collapse. She thought about Clara Hess on the train. Something wrong with that man. Something that has decided it does not want to be saved. She thought 3 years ago. Something happened 3 years ago. She did not ask him about it. Not yet. She filed it where she filed everything that was important and not yet ready to be spoken, deep and careful and available when the time came. "Here is what I can tell you," she said. "I can manage this household so that nothing is wasted and everything possible is used. I can feed 4 men well enough that they stay, and you cannot afford to lose Silas or Tommy or Rex right now. I can rebuild the food stores through the winter so that come spring you are not paying for food you should have preserved in autumn. I can run this kitchen as a business because that is what it is." She paused. "I cannot fix the debt. I cannot bring back the cattle, but I can make sure that the domestic side of this operation stops bleeding, and that is not nothing." He looked at her across the desk. Something moved through his expression, not warmth, not exactly, but something like recognition. The look of a man encountering something that does not fit his existing categories and is deciding whether to make room for it. "All right," he said. She took the household ledger back to the kitchen and spread it across the work table and began. She went to Garnet 3 times in the first 2 weeks. The first trip she made with Rex, who drove the heavy wagon and loaded supplies without conversation, which suited her. She had a list, and she worked through it with the precision of a woman who knows exactly how far a dollar needs to go. The second trip she made alone, driving the lighter wagon herself, she had learned the road quickly as she learned most practical things, and she preferred to negotiate without an audience. She went to see a man named Horace Pratt at the general store, who had been extending credit to Iron Bell Ranch for 2 years on increasingly uncertain terms, and who looked at her with the skepticism appropriate to a man who had been promised more than he had received on multiple occasions. She laid out a proposal, a running account on staple goods, paid down in regular weekly amounts. Small amounts but consistent, regular as the calendar. He looked at her over his counter for a long time. "Mr. Callister sent you?" he asked. "He did not," she said. "I came on my own judgment." Something in his expression shifted, a small recalculation of the situation. "He know you're here. He will when I tell him." That evidently was the right thing to say. He agreed to the account. The third trip is to call on a woman named Bess Harmon, who had stood witness at the wedding and who lived in a neat house at the south end of Garnet and kept the best stocked pantry Nora had seen since Abilene. She had come with a wall of her preserved tomatoes, the ones she had canned herself from the last of summer's tomatoes in Abilene, brought packed carefully in her trunk, and she left with a sack of dried corn that Bess had in surplus and a standing invitation to call again. The small economy of a working household, this was something she understood in her bones. You did not survive on money alone. You survived on relationship and exchange, and the particular kind of trust that was built through showing up consistently with what you had said you would have. She had been building these small economies for most of her adult life. She started with what she had and she built from it. She established a system in the kitchen. A notebook on a nail beside the pantry door, tallies of everything in and out, updated every morning before the fire was fully up and every evening after the supper dishes were done. Flour, cornmeal, lard, salt, coffee, sugar, dried beans, what came in, what went out, what the balance was. Nothing formal, just her own shorthand, cramped and precise, the kind of notation only she could fully read, which was intentional. She made bread every 2 days. She made bean soup and corn chowder and salt pork stew. She made biscuits on Sundays, which had become, without anyone saying so, the closest thing Iron Bell Ranch had to a ritual. The biscuits on Sunday morning served with the last of the week's preserved fruit and strong coffee, a small concession to the idea that one day might be different from the others. She learned the smokehouse. Silas knew the method, the type of wood, the temperature, the timing, and he showed her without condescension, which she appreciated and which told her something about who he was. She improved on what he showed her, smoking a pork shoulder she had bought in Garnet and 2 large cuts of venison that Tommy had brought in after a hunt. And by the second week of December, the smokehouse had actual meat in it for the first time in a year. She turned and composted the kitchen garden, even though it was too late in the season to plant anything. She was planning for spring, the men noticed. Men? Not dramatically, these were not men who made speeches about improved conditions or offered elaborate praise. But they showed up for meals 10 minutes early now instead of right on time. Silas had started leaving his hat on the hook inside the door instead of on the table. Tommy had begun helping clear dishes without being asked, a small instinctive domesticity that she did not comment on because commenting would have embarrassed him. Rex, who said almost nothing, had begun leaving small, practical gifts outside the kitchen door. A bucket of water refilled a cord of wood cut to the length she preferred for the range. He never said anything about it. She never said anything about it. It was a language they had found without discussing it. Nora Callahan was learning what Iron Bell Ranch was in its current state and in its bones. She was also learning what it needed to become. And she was learning with the careful attention she brought to all things that the most complicated part of what she was trying to do here had almost nothing to do with food or accounts or kitchen gardens. It had to do with the man in the locked room down the hall. She found the box on a Thursday morning in the third week of December. She had been in the root cellar since before first light, doing a full inventory, the monthly accounting she had established for herself, checking everything against the notebook, assessing what the winter reserves looked like going into the new year. It was cold down there, the kind of cold that comes up through the packed earth and settles in your ankles, and she worked quickly and methodically by the light of the lantern Silas had hung on the low rafter. She was checking the lower shelves, the ones at floor level, that were too low for most things, but occasionally held jars that had been pushed to the back and forgotten when she found it. It was not hidden exactly. It was simply overlooked, a small, flat-sided wooden box, perhaps 12 inches long and 8 wide, pushed to the very back of the lowest shelf in the far corner, behind a crock of old sauerkraut that had been there since before Nora arrived. She brought it forward into the lantern light, It was plain pine, no lock, the lid fitted tightly from age and damp. She opened it. Opened. Letters. A small stack of them tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon that had been tied and untied enough times that it held its bow without difficulty. She lifted the top letter and turned it over. The envelope was addressed in a woman's handwriting, careful, well-formed, the handwriting of someone who had been taught properly and had maintained the habit. The return address was a town in Idaho she didn't recognize. The recipient, W. Callister, Iron Bell Ranch, Bitterroot County, Montana Territory. The date on the postmark, November 1882, 3 years ago. She set the envelope down without opening it. She sat for a long moment in the cold root cellar with the box in her lap and the lantern throwing uncertain shadows across the low ceiling. She counted the letters without removing them from the box. 11. The ribbon had been tied and retied many times. The envelopes at the bottom were more worn than the ones at the top, suggesting they had been handled more frequently. The last letter in the stack, one on top, the most recent, had a different quality. The writing on the envelope was the same hand, but the letter inside had been opened and refolded and replaced many times. She could tell from the quality of the creases, the softness of the paper at the fold lines. Someone had read this letter over and over again. She put the letters back in the box. She tied the ribbon carefully. She replaced the box precisely where she had found it, behind the sauerkraut crock in the corner of the lowest shelf. She climbed back up to the barn and stood for a moment in the thin winter light that came through the high windows, her hands at her sides. Not his wife's letters. His wife had died 7 years ago. These letters were postmarked from 3 to 4 years ago, after after the ranch had already been established. A woman in Idaho who had written to Wade Callister 11 times, whose letters he had kept in a box in the root cellar, whose last letter he had read until the paper went soft at the creases. Clara Hess on the train, something wrong with that man. Something closed off. Something that has decided it does not want to be saved. Nora looked out the barn window at the iron-gray Montana sky. The ranch had been failing for 3 years. Wade had been failing for 3 years. And somewhere in that same span of time, a woman in Idaho had written him 11 letters, and he had kept everyone. She was the last name on the list. She was beginning to understand with the particular clarity that came to her when things she had been observing in fragments finally assembled themselves into a whole, that she was not the last choice of a man looking for a household manager. She was the last choice of a man who had decided to stop. She went back to the kitchen. She put water on for coffee. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top in her careful hand, what we have, what we can use, what we can save. She worked until a house woke up around her, and she thought, sitting in the kitchen that was slowly becoming hers, listening to the iron range tick and the Montana wind come down off the mountains, and the distant sounds of the ranch beginning another day, I am not going anywhere. Whatever he has decided, he has not consulted me, and I do not agree with it. 2 women had been offered this place and had left. She had come to stay. She intended to mean it. Winter settled over Bitterroot County the way it always settled over Montana. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of transition, but all at once and with authority. By the second week of December, the temperature dropped below freezing before noon and held there through the night, and the wind off the mountains came in long, deliberate gusts that found every gap in the walls of Iron Bell's main house with the patient thoroughness of something that had all the time it needed. Nora found every gap, too. She moved through the house in the evenings after the men had gone to the bunk house with a candle to show her where the drafts were, the flame bending toward any crack or separation, the thin, cold air making its presence known. She noted each one in the back of her notebook and addressed them one by one. Rags stuffed into the worst of the wall gaps, a piece of oilcloth she found in the cellar nailed across a window frame that had pulled away from the sill, a length of rope weather stripping she improvised for the kitchen back door, which had been letting the cold in for what appeared to be several seasons. She asked Rex to help her bank earth against the north foundation wall on a day when the temperature briefly lifted and the ground was workable, and he did it without comment or complaint, which was Rex's way. The house held heat better after. Not well, it was still an imperfectly sealed building, fighting a Montana winter with an iron range and a parlor fireplace, but better. Measurably better. She knew because she could feel it in her ankles, which no longer ached by mid-morning from the cold coming up through the kitchen floor. She carried the spare blankets she found in an upstairs trunk to the bunkhouse, without asking permission from anyone. 3 blankets heavy wool musty from storage but sound. She dropped them on the bunkhouse table without ceremony and left. That evening at supper, Tommy folded his blanket once and put it under his chair and ate the whole meal with one hand occasionally resting on it like a man making sure something hasn't moved. Silas said nothing. Rex thanked her quietly in a way that had more weight than the single word and looked at the table as he said it. She kept cooking. This was her primary instrument, and she knew it. Not because feeding people was the whole of what she had to offer, but because in a struggling household in a difficult winter, nourishment was the most direct means she had of keeping people present. A man who was well fed was a man who had a reason to stay at supper, and a man who stayed at supper was a man who was still part of something. And if the men left, the ranch was finished regardless of what the bank decided. She made bean chili with the dried chilies and the smoked pork stretched with the canned tomatoes she had found at the back of the root cellar shelf and the dried onions she had been rationing carefully since November. She made potato soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, seasoned with the last of the dried herbs she had brought from Abilene. She made cornbread every other day because it was cheap and filling, and the men ate it without reservation, and she made biscuits on Sundays, and the Sunday biscuits, had become in the 3 weeks since her arrival the closest thing the ranch had to a shared ritual. Nobody had said so. It had simply become true. She traded. It had started with Bess Harmon, who had given her the dried corn in November. In December, Nora drove to Garnet with 6 jars of the preserved tomatoes she had put up in Abilene. She had brought them, knowing they would be useful somewhere, sometime, and they were useful now, and she traded them with Bess for a sack of dried lentils and a small crock of rendered beef tallow that Bess had in surplus. From Bess, she had learned that a family named Drummond, who farmed 12 miles north of Garnet, had put up more apple butter than they could use in a year. Nora drove to the Drummonds with 2 jars of cornbread and came back with 4 crocks of apple butter. The apple butter went into Sunday breakfast, spread thick on the biscuits, and the change in the quality of Sunday mornings at Iron Bell was something she measured in the way the men sat at the table afterward, less quickly with their coffee cups still in their hands. She was building something. She knew it. She was building it the way she built everything, one small piece at a time, each piece connecting to the next, the whole becoming visible only when you stepped back far enough to see it. So, yeah, Rex had a wife in Garnet. She had not known this immediately. He did not speak about his personal life, and nothing in the arrangements at Iron Bell had mentioned it, which was not surprising, given that the arrangements at Iron Bell appeared to have been made with the minimum possible amount of human consideration for the people they affected. But in the 3rd week of December, when she had gone to Garnet on the regular supply run, she had seen Rex in the street outside the post office talking to a woman who was visibly ill, thin in a way that had not always been thin pale under the winter color, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body required management. Rex had his hand on her arm and was speaking quietly and with an intensity that was entirely unlike the flat reserved presence he maintained at the ranch. Nora had gone into the post office to collect the ranch mail without looking at him again. On the drive back to Iron Bell, she thought about what she had seen. The woman's pallor. The way Rex had looked at her, not frantic, not desperate, but with the particular care of a man who has been watching someone he loves be sick for a long time and has learned to be steady about it because steadiness is what is needed. The way he had looked like 2 different people at once, the quiet, self-contained ranch hand, and the man who came home to something that cost him. She went into Garnet on her own the following Thursday. She took the lighter wagon and she stopped at the doctor's office. First, a compact man named Hedberg, who had been in Garnet for 6 years and who told her when she asked about Adeline Fossey that Adeline had a chest condition that had been worsening since summer. He told her this after a moment's hesitation because Nora had asked with the specific quality of concern that convinces a person you are asking for the right reasons. What she needed was a chest rub camphor-based, if he had it, and broth. Hot broth as often as possible. Nora stopped at Bess Harmon's house and traded one of the last of the Abilene tomato jars for a small tin of camphor rub that Bess kept for her own chest trouble. Then she went to the small house on the south end of Garnet where Rex's wife lived. Adeline Foss was 28 years old and she had a small child, a boy, perhaps 2, who was healthy and lively and deeply skeptical of Nora, and a chest that rattled when she breathed. She was grateful in the way of a woman who has been managing alone and has reached the point where accepting help is no longer a matter of pride but of survival. Nora gave her the camphor rub and the instructions for using it, and she left a pail of the smoked venison broth she had brought along in a covered pot, and she sat with Adeline for half an hour while the child played on the floor and the fire worked at the cold in the small room. Rex doesn't know I'm here, Nora said. I know, Adeline said. She was looking at the pot of broth with an expression that had nothing to do with food. He won't hear it from me, Nora said. Adeline looked at her. Something in the look said, who are you and why are you doing this? And the answer Nora could have given, because you need it and it was in my power to give it, would have sounded insufficient, even though it was completely true. I'll come again, Nora said, when I'm in town. She drove back to Iron Bell through the gray December afternoon, the wagon wheels cutting through the thin new snow, the mountains on all sides going white and patient, and she thought about Rex at the supper table that evening, cutting his bread with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned not to let the weight show. And she thought the ranch is not just Wade Callister. The ranch is all of them. Everything that holds one of them holds the whole. She said nothing to Rex about Adeline. But 3 days later, he came into the kitchen before supper and said without looking at her that he had been into town and Adeline had asked him to pass along her thanks. Nora said, the broth is simple. I'll send more when I go in on Thursday. Rex nodded. He left. That was all. It was enough. Harlan came to the kitchen for his morning coffee. This was new. He had in the first weeks taken his coffee to the office, arrived at the kitchen doorway where he poured his cup from the pot she left on the back of the range and retreated without ceremony. She had understood this as his way of taking what was necessary from the household without acknowledging that the household was something that warranted acknowledgement. A practical transaction. He needed coffee. There was coffee. He took it. But in the third week of December, he did not retreat. She was at the work table when she heard him pour his cup, and she waited for the sound of his footsteps moving toward the hall, and the footsteps did not come. She looked up. He was standing at the range with his cup, looking at the kitchen window, at the yard, and the snow beyond it, gray and still in the early morning light. Not looking at her, just standing in the kitchen. She went back to what she was doing. He stood for perhaps 5 minutes and then left without a word. The next morning, the same thing, and the morning after. He began very gradually in the way of a man who is making concessions he has not formally acknowledged making, to stand in the kitchen for those few minutes in the morning, not talking, not doing anything particularly purposeful, just present. The way a man might stand in a warm room after being outside in the cold, allowing himself something without making a statement about it. She let it be. She was learning Wade Callister through observation, the way she learned most things, not from what was said, but from what was done. He was a man who had been alone in the deepest sense for some time. Not lonely, she had the strong impression that he had arranged himself against loneliness so thoroughly that he had stopped feeling it, the way a person who has been cold for long enough stops registering cold. But alone, managing, enduring, present in the practical sense only. She observed the small things. He repaired a fence section on the east boundary on a day so cold the air cracked with it, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had ridden out and seen it needed doing and done it. She noted this because it was not the action of a man who had given up on his property. It was the action of a man who still responded on some level to what needed doing even when he had decided he was done caring. There was a contradiction in him. She held it quietly and kept watching. One evening in late December, she came into the kitchen at dusk to find him there, not in the doorway, but actually in the kitchen, standing at the east window, which looked out over the yard and the barn, and in the distance the first dark line of the mountains. He did not hear her come in. She stood for a moment in the connecting doorway and looked at the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who is not at rest but is holding still. She went to the range and added a log without making more noise than necessary. He heard her then and turned around. Something crossed his face, a quick, controlled movement, the expression of a man who has been found doing something he hadn't intended to be found doing, though nothing about standing in a kitchen looking out a window required concealment. Supper's at 6, she said, practical, without comment on the rest. I know, he said. He left. But that evening at supper, he said something to Silas about the condition of the north pasture fence, and Silas answered with the cautious attention of a man responding to someone who has been silent a long time, as though he was not entirely certain the voice was real. And Nora at the counter drying dishes continued drying dishes and said nothing. She had learned to let things be what they were without requiring them to be more. She fell asleep at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night in the last week of December. It was not the first time she had worked past midnight that week. The monthly accounts were due in her own reckoning. She kept them independent of anything Wade had given her. A parallel set of books that tracked the kitchen's resources against its output and charted what was needed and when. And she had been at them after supper on top of a full day that had included a baking run, a trip to the cellar, and the mending of the bunkhouse stovepipe, which had separated at the joint, in which she had addressed herself with a section of tin and a pair of pliers after waiting 2 days for someone else to notice it. She sat down with her notebook and her tea at the kitchen table at 9:30, intending to work through the January projections. The range was banked for the night. The lamp was turned low to save oil. She did not make it through the January projections. She woke in the very early morning, disoriented, her neck stiff, and one hand still curved around the pencil she had been writing with. The lamp had burned down to almost nothing. The range was quiet, but still holding tended. She understood immediately to the precise degree required to hold through the night. That was a skill. Not everyone knew how to bank a fire so it lasted without smothering. There was a blanket around her shoulders. She sat very still for a long moment. The blanket was heavy wool, the kind that had been stored in cedars. She knew it by the smell, dry and faintly medicinal. She had inventoried every blanket in the main house in November, and she knew which closet this one had come from, the upstairs hall closet, the good blankets, the ones she had set aside for guests who never came. Someone had come into the kitchen while she was asleep, had turned the lamp to low so the oil would not waste out, had tended the fire with the care required to make it hold, had gone upstairs to the hall closet and brought down a blanket and laid it around her shoulders without waking her. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the banked fire and thought very carefully about who had done this. She knew. She sat with it for a long time. Then she thought with the same precision she brought to everything, this is not what I came here for. This is not what was offered, and this is not what I should make it into. He came in and he found you asleep and he covered you. That is a practical act of decency, not a declaration of anything. You will not make it into a declaration of something it is not. But she also thought he could have walked past. He didn't. She folded the blanket neatly the next morning and carried it to her room and put it at the foot of her bed, and she slept under it for the rest of the winter. Neither of them ever mentioned it, but something had shifted between them, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named, but in the way that foundations shift when the frost goes deep and then releases. Change without announcement, altered without ceremony. She thought about it sometimes in the dark of her small room, listening to the Montana wind work at the house, and she thought that is what it feels like to be seen by someone who was not intending to see you. She did not know what to do with the feeling. She had built herself over a long time around the assumption that being seen was something that happened to other people. She was learning that she had been wrong about that. She was also learning to be careful. Careful in the way of a woman who has been disappointed precisely enough times to understand the difference between what is real and what she is making real because she would like it to be. She did not allow herself to want more than she had, but she noticed everything. January was hard in the way that Montana January is always hard, not simply cold, but relentless. The cold, not an event, but a condition persisting through the days and nights with the patient authority of something that has no obligation to end. The snow was deep by the second week, and the wind moved it in long horizontal sheets that turned the yard into a white nothing by mid-morning. Nora kept the range burning and kept the food coming and kept the notebook on its nail. She had, by January, established a genuine trading arrangement with 3 families. The Drummonds with their apple butter, a widow named Mrs. Petch, who had dried beans in quantity and was glad of the smoked venison Nora could offer, and the Harmon household, where the exchange had expanded from that first jar of tomatoes into a regular and mutual dependence that Bess Harmon described as the most sensible thing she had done in years. Nothing formal, nothing that required an agreement or a signature, just the particular commerce of women who understand that shared resources go further than hoarded ones. The kitchen income, it was income, she had to call it what it was, went directly into the kitchen. She kept a separate column for it in her notebook, small numbers added, carefully tracking what came in and what it went toward. It was not a large amount, but it was real. She told Wade about it in early February when she had enough to report. He was in the office. She stood into the doorway, She had learned not to sit until last, not because he was unkind about it, but because standing gave her a certain clarity of purpose and told him what she had built. The trading network, the small income from preserves and baked goods, the column in the notebook. He looked at her with the expression she was coming to know, the one that was not quite surprise and not quite evaluation, but something that partook of both, something updating itself. That money is yours, he said. It goes to the kitchen. Then it's the ranch's money. He paused, a long pause longer than was strictly necessary, which means it's yours anyway. You're the one running it. She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the papers on his desk. Thank you, she said. He nodded once as though he had simply delivered a piece of information and the information was now delivered. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table for a long time, her hands flat on the pine surface, and she thought about those words, "You're the one running it," and what they meant from a man who said nothing he did not mean. She thought about whether being chosen last was entirely the thing she had always believed it was. She was beginning to think it might not be. But she had been at Ironabel for 2 months when she found out what the locked room held. She had known about the room since her first week. It was at the end of the ground floor hallway, just before the back door, a door that was always closed and never discussed. She had noted it the way she noted everything filed, held waiting for context. She had asked Wade once in passing what was in it. Storage, he said. She had not asked again. She could tell when a question had been answered and when it had simply been closed. But she noticed. She noticed that Silas's eyes moved to the door sometimes and then away, with the careful avoidance of a man who is choosing not to look at something. She noticed that the door was the only one in the house with a real lock, rather than a simple latch, a proper iron lock with a keyhole, the key presumably on Wade's person. She noticed that the hallway outside the door smelled very faintly of something she couldn't immediately name. Something dry and slightly sweet like cedar or lavender. The ghost of a scent that had been pressed into wood and cloth a long time ago. On a night in the second week of January, a particular gust of wind, the kind that arrived with enough force to shake the window frames and find the loose points of every door, hit the house at the angle that caught the back hallway. She was in the kitchen when she heard it, the sound of a door opening, not violently, but with the specific creak of a door that is blown open because the latch did not catch. She came out of the kitchen into the hallway. The door at the end of the hall was open, not wide, perhaps a foot, perhaps a little more. The wind had pushed it from the outside through some gap in the exterior wall that she had not yet found, and the lock had not held because the strike plate was loose and had been loose for some time. She could see it in the way the door hung. The latch side had dropped slightly. The lock had always been inadequate, held in place by habit and intention rather than by any real mechanical security. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked to the door and looked in. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, a single window facing the yard, the thin light from the hallway lamp falling across the floor in a long diagonal. The window had its curtain drawn, a curtain of pale blue cotton that had faded at the edges. She took all of this in from the doorway, not entering. There was furniture, a small writing desk against the far wall, a chair beside it, a woman's chair with a cushioned seat and slightly carved back. There was a basket on the floor beside the chair, the kind of basket used for needlework or mending, and inside it the pale gleam of an embroidery hoop with some work still in it. There was a shelf on the right-hand wall with 3 small items, a lamp, a folded piece of cloth that might have been a shawl, and a framed drawing pencil on paper, small perhaps 6 inches by 8, a careful rendering of the ranch house as seen from the eastern slope. Not his wife's. His wife had been dead for 7 years. The wear on the furniture was not 7 years old. The drawing, she could not see it clearly from the doorway, but she could see the style of it had been made by someone who had stood on the eastern slope and looked at Ironbell with the particular attention of a person who was learning to love something. Nora stood in the hallway and looked at the room and understood what she was looking at. Someone had lived in this room or almost lived in it. Someone had planned to. Someone had brought their chair and their needlework basket and their embroidery hoop and had stood on the slope east of the ranch and drawn the house with care and hung the drawing on the shelf. And then something had changed, and the person had left, and Wade Callister had locked the door and kept the key on his person and called the room storage when his wife asked about it. She pulled the door closed. She put her shoulder to it and worked the latch until it caught. She would deal with the strike plate tomorrow. She went back to the kitchen. She put water on to boil. She sat at the work table and she thought about the heft of those 11 letters in the root cellar box, the blue ribbon tied and retied. She thought about Clara Hess on the train. She thought about the dates, everything converging on the same 3-year period. She thought about the year in which the operating losses were unexplained by any recorded circumstance when Wade Callister appeared to have simply stopped attending to his ranch. She understood now what had happened 3 years ago. A woman, a specific woman whose name was not yet known to her, who had been at Iron Bell long enough to bring her chair and her needlework and to learn the shape of the land from the eastern slope, who had decided not to stay, who had written 11 letters since the last of which had been read so many times it had gone soft at the creases. Wade Callister had not been failing his ranch for 3 years. He had been in mourning for 3 years, not for his wife, for the loss of this. Nora sat in the kitchen for a long time that night. She thought about what it cost to decide to stop, to look at something that had been alive and decide not to try to keep it alive any longer. She thought about the particular courage of that decision, if you could call it courage, which she was not sure you could, and the particular cowardice of it, which she was more certain of. She thought about what it might take to undo a decision like that. She thought, I did not come here to undo it. I came here because this is where I am, and what I do is work with what I find, not what I wish were different. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not mention the room to anyone. It was Pete who told her things were different. She did not have a Pete. She had Silas, which was not the same thing, but served a similar function. An older man with the particular wisdom of someone who had seen more than he said and said more than he appeared to. He came to her on a cold morning in late January, when the temperature had dropped far enough that the breath of the horses was visible from the kitchen window, and he sat down at the kitchen table without being asked and accepted the coffee. She poured without comment, and he was quiet for a while in the way of a man working up to something. I want to tell you something, he said finally. She was at the work table, her hands in bread dough. All right, she said. He looked at his coffee cup. I've been here since the beginning, he said. 15 years. I was here when the ranch was right, when it had a full crew and good contracts, and the house was kept up, and the kitchen smelled like something. He paused. I stayed through all of it, the bad years and the worse ones. I stayed because of Mr. Callister, not because of what he became, but because of what he was, and because I reckoned whatever he was would come back if I waited long enough. She kept working the dough. She knew better than to interrupt a man who had decided to say something. The last 3 years, Silas said. I thought about leaving, more than once. Not from want, but because a place dies, a working place, when the person responsible for it decides he's done. The ranch was dying, not from the money or the hands or the cattle, from the man who owns it deciding to let it. He looked at his hands. I had almost decided. And then, she said. He looked at her. And then you got here, and the kitchen came back on. She turned the bread in the bowl, covered it, moved it near the range to rise. The food helped, Silas continued. I'll tell you that plainly. A man who's not being fed well will leave before a man who is, all other things being equal. But it wasn't only the food. He drank his coffee. You know what it was. She waited. It was that the house felt like it was being taken care of again, he said. Like someone had decided it was worth taking care of. He looked at the window. A place like this, it knows. The cattle, the land, the building itself. It knows when someone is tending it, and it knows when it's being let go. The last few years, this place felt like it was being let go. He set down his cup. It doesn't feel like that now. She stood for a moment with her flour-dusted hands at her sides. I'm just managing the household, she said. I know, said Silas with the particular tone of a man who considers this the complete and sufficient answer. He stood, put on his hat, and went out into the cold. She stood in the kitchen for a while after he left, looking at the covered bowl of bread dough rising in the warmth of the range, and she thought about what he had said. A place knows when it's being tended. She thought about whether that was true of people as well. She thought it probably was. February came in cold and got colder. The sale of the eastern parcel had not yet closed. She knew this because she had become, in the course of the months since November, the person who collected the ranch mail in Garnet, and she could track the bank's correspondence by its envelopes, the formal printed letterhead of the Bitterroot Territorial Bank, arriving on the first and third weeks of the month with the regularity of a bad conscience. She did not open these letters. She brought them to Wade, and she watched his face when he took them, and she read in the set of his jaw and the stillness that came into him what the letters contained. The buyer for the eastern parcel was still considering. The bank was not apparently willing to consider indefinitely. She went back to the kitchen and worked. She had by now built the trading network into something that functioned without her constant attention. Bess Harmon had taken to making the Thursday pickup herself, bringing whatever Nora had put aside and leaving whatever was in trade, and this arrangement had become so established that neither of them needed to discuss it. The smokehouse held enough for the rest of the winter and into early spring. The root cellar was better stocked than it had been in at least 2 years by Silas's accounting. The kitchen notebook was precise and accurate and showed for anyone who cared to read it that the household was being managed with the efficiency of a small business. It was during this period that Tommy began with the gradual instinctiveness of a young person learning to live somewhere for the first time to help. Not because she asked him. He simply appeared one morning with the kindling already cut to the right length and placed beside the range, and appeared another morning, having filled the water buckets before she came down, and one evening sat at the kitchen table, after supper had been cleared, and without looking up asked if she needed the flour sacks sorted. She said she did. He sorted them with the careful attention of someone doing a job for the first time and wanting to do it right. She did not make a fuss about this. She thanked him each time plainly and moved on. She sensed that making more of it would embarrass him. But she watched. She was always watching. Tommy Briggs had been at Iron Bell for 2 years. He had arrived at 17 with no family to speak of and no particular sense of where else to be. He was 20 now, thin and serious, with a young man's face that was slowly finding its adult shape. He had no idea how to be anywhere. He was learning here in this kitchen, in these mornings, with their practical ritual of fire and water and food, what it meant to belong to something. She was teaching him without ever saying she was teaching him. That was how you did it. That was how it had always been done by the women who understood that the point was not the instruction, but the doing, not the explanation, but the example. She put an extra biscuit on his plate on Sunday mornings and did not comment. He ate it with the focused attention of someone receiving something they have been given enough times to begin to trust. It was on a Tuesday in the second week of March that Miriam came. Nora was at the root cellar doing the monthly accounting when she heard the wagon in the yard. Not the ranch wagon, different, lighter, the sound of a single horse moving fast. She came up from the cellar and looked across the yard and saw a woman climbing down from a hired rig from Garnet, and she stood in the barn doorway and watched. The woman was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who has money and wears it with ease. Nothing extravagant, nothing trying too hard, just the quality of fabric and cut that announced itself quietly. Dark hair with silver in it, worn in a careful style. A composed face that was still handsome and would have been more than handsome 20 years ago. She moved with the particular ease of a woman who had always been at home wherever she found herself. She looked around the yard and then she saw Nora and she walked toward her. "I'm looking for Wade Callister," she said. Her voice was warm and direct. "I'm an old friend. My name is Miriam Hale." Nora looked at her. Miriam Hale. Not Miriam, a surname now. She had been married. The letters in the root cellar had been from a woman with an Idaho address. Mrs. Miriam Hale, who had been an old friend, who had been something considerably more than that, who had written 11 times and whose last letter had been read until the paper went soft. "I'll take you to him," Nora said. She led Miriam across the yard to the office and knocked twice and opened the door, and she said, "There's a Mrs. Hale here to see you." And she saw the absolute stillness that came over Wade's face. The stillness of a man encountering something he had not prepared for, which was notable. Because in her observation, Wade Callister had prepared himself for most things by preparing himself for nothing. She left them together and went back to the kitchen. She made bread dough and set it to rise. She started a pot of beans for supper. She kept her hands busy and her mind practical, and she did not listen to whatever was happening in the office, not because she had no interest, but because listening was not going to serve any useful purpose, and she was a woman who did not waste herself on the useless. She went out to the kitchen garden in the thin March light and turned a section she had been meaning to get to before the weather warmed further. The soil was still cold but workable in the top layer. She worked with a spade for an hour and turned 3 sections and went back in and made coffee and waited. Miriam Hale stayed for 3 hours. At the end of it, Nora heard the office door and voices in the hall. Wade's and Miriam's low and without particular emotion, the voices of people who have said what needed saying and have run out of unsaid things. Then the front door, then hooves on the frozen yard moving toward the road. Nora did not come out of the kitchen. That evening after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Wade appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coffee cup in his hand, and he stood there in a way that was different from his usual evenings in the kitchen doorway. He stood there with the look of a man who had something to say and was working out how. She was drying dishes. "You know who she was," he said. It was not a question. "I had some idea," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She's been a widow since last year," he said. "Her husband was a banker in Boise. He died in the autumn." Nora dried a bowl without speaking. "She came to tell me." He stopped, looked at his coffee, started again. "She said she had made a mistake 3 years ago. She said she wanted to know if I had," another pause, "if the situation here was one that could accommodate a change." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the March wind moved across the yard with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was no longer the absolute cold of January. "What did you tell her?" Nora asked. Wade looked at the kitchen window. "I told her the situation here was not one that could accommodate a change," he said. She turned to look at him. His expression was the same carefully managed stillness it usually was, but there was something underneath it, something that had recently been handled, set down, closed, not settled, handled. "She is very gracious," Nora said. "She is," he agreed. They stood in the kitchen for a moment with the facts of the situation between them plain and unembellished. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her directly with the quality of attention that was not common to him, but that she had been seeing more frequently in the last weeks. Not measuring. Something more open than measuring. "That's a long answer," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he set his coffee cup down on the table and he sat down in the chair closest to the range, the chair he had been sitting in for the last 2 months on the evenings he came to the kitchen, and he put his hands on his knees. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Outside, the Montana dark came down over Iron Bell Ranch, over the barn and the bunkhouse and the kitchen garden. She had been turning that afternoon over the empty room at the end of the hallway that held a chair and a needlework basket and a drawing of the house as seen from the east. The ranch was quiet in the particular way of a place settling into what it was. Wade Callister looked at his hands for a long time. Then he began to talk. He did not tell it easily. This was not a man who had kept a story inside him for 3 years and was now looking for the relief of telling it. It was a man who had kept a story inside him for 3 years and had decided somewhere in the course of this quiet March evening that not telling it any longer required more of him than the alternative. There was a difference, and she understood it. He told it slowly in the way he did most things, with economy and without performance, the facts assembled without embellishment, the feeling present in the spaces between the words rather than in the words themselves. Her name had been Miriam Shaw when he had met her. She had come to Garnet in the spring of 1882, a woman recently separated from a difficult situation in Idaho, passing through with the intention of going further west. She had stopped at Iron Bell because her horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles short of the ranch, and Silas had been the one to find her on the road. She had stayed one night. She had stayed a week. She had stayed the summer. He had been a widower for 4 years by then. His wife Anne had died of a fever in the winter of 1878. He had grieved her and continued. The ranch had been good in those years. The herd was strong. The contracts were solid. The crew was full and capable. He had not been happy exactly because happiness requires a kind of attention he had never been very good at. But he had been functional, present, invested in what he had built. Miriam had been different. He said this not with sentiment, but with the frank directness of a man who is being accurate about a fact. She had been different. She had read the land the way a person reads a language they learned young, easily, with recognition, with the particular pleasure of a mind meeting something it was made for. She had learned to ride again after years away from it on one of his horses, and he had watched her from the fence and thought, this is someone who belongs here. Not in the way of admiration, in the way of recognition. By the end of that summer, he had asked her to stay, not as a working arrangement, as a wife, as someone to build the next part of what there was left to build. She had said yes. She had gone back to Idaho to arrange her affairs and to deal with whatever the difficult situation had left undone, and she had said she would return by October. October had come and she had not. He had written. The letters had taken time to arrive in both directions, and her answers had been careful, and getting more careful, and the October she had promised had become November, and November had become December. And when the letter had finally arrived, explaining that she could not come, not that she did not want to, or that she had stopped wanting to, but that she could not, for reasons she did not fully explain, he had read it and folded it and put it in the box in the cellar, and that had been the end of that. He had been working through the particulars with the meticulous attention of a man who has decided to account for something completely and then be done with it, the reasons for her going, the failure to return the 11 subsequent letters that had come over the following 2 years, the way he had read each one and answered none of them and kept them all, 3 years of keeping what he could not have and not reaching for what he could. The ranch, Nora said. It was the first thing she had said in a long time. He looked at her. You stopped tending it, she said. Not because of the drought or the disease or the legal trouble. Those things happened, but they happened to a man who had already decided to stop. He looked at the table. His jaw worked once. Yes, he said. And when she came today, he was quiet for a moment. The fire in the range had settled to a deep, even heat, and the kitchen was warm in a way it had not been when she first arrived. She came to say she was free now, he said, and that she had been wrong to let the situation in Idaho stop her, that she had been afraid of what she was choosing and had let the fear make the choice for her. He looked at his hands. She wanted to know if it was too late. He looked up. Something in his expression was entirely unguarded for a moment, the look of a man who has carried something for a long time and has just set it down and is not yet entirely sure what to do with the fact that his hands are empty. I told her yes, he said. I told her there was a woman in this house who had done things for this place that couldn't be undone, and that the arrangement I had made was not one I was willing to undo. Nora was very still. An arrangement, she said. He heard the word. She could see that he heard it, heard the weight she had put in it, heard what it contained. I said the wrong word. He said yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working in his expression, not discomfort, not exactly, but the particular effort of a man who is reaching for something he isn't in the habit of reaching for. You are the reasons this ranch is alive, he said. It came out plain with no decoration, the way he said everything. Not the food, though the food matters. Not the accounts, though the accounts matter, because of what you decided this place was worth, when you had every reason to decide otherwise. She looked at him. Everyone had decided it wasn't worth it, he said, including me. And you came here anyway, and you looked at it, and you decided it was. And everything that has happened since comes from that one decision. The kitchen was very quiet around them. I came here because I had nowhere else to be, she said. That was the truth of it. I know. He looked at her steadily. And what did you find when you got here? She thought about that. She thought about the dead kitchen garden and the empty pantry and the cold range and the men in the bunkhouse who had stopped looking up when wagons came in. She thought about the root cellar and the box of letters and the locked door and the drawing on the shelf. She thought about Tommy cutting kindling before she asked, and Rex leaving water filled, and Silas saying a place knows when it's being tended. She thought about the blanket around her shoulders in December and the feel of the wool and the smell of cedar and the fact that he had stood there for a while after. Somewhere I needed to be, she said. The firelight lay across the kitchen floor in a long diagonal. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold and indifferent and beautiful the way it always was. The ranch was quiet. Wade Callister was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before and did not have a name for yet something that was not warm in the easy performed way, but was warm in the way of something that has been there for some time and has finally been allowed to be visible. I want to say something to you, he said. All right. I didn't send to that agency because I wanted a wife, he said. I want to be honest about that. I sent because I needed someone to run the household, and I had run out of any interest in running it myself. I thought if I cannot care about this place, find someone who can. Let them do it. Let me pay them and call it a marriage and let the rest of it be. She waited. I thought that was all I was capable of, he said. After Miriam left, I thought that's the end of that particular kind of thing for me. I am 54 years old and I have used up whatever I had for it, and this is what remains. Practicality, function, paying someone to keep the fire going. And, she said, He looked at the sign that was not yet on the wall, looked at the wall where a sign might go if a man made one, and then he looked at her. You changed the calculation, he said. Not all at once. Slowly. The way things change when you're not watching them change, and then you look up one morning and something is different and you understand it's been different for some time. He paused. I started coming to the kitchen for my coffee because the kitchen was the only room in the house that felt like it had a reason to exist. And then it was because I wanted to be where you were, and I told myself that was the same thing for a considerable number of mornings before I admitted to myself that it wasn't. Nora put her hands flat on the table. I am 37 years old, she said. I am not young, and I am not beautiful, and I am not what men look for when they decide they want something. I have been passed over enough times to understand that very clearly. I know, he said. I came here knowing I was the last choice, knowing you had tried for women who suited you better, and they had left. You were not the last choice, he said. You were the only one who stayed. That is not the same thing as being chosen. No, he said, it isn't. He looked at her steadily. So let me choose, clearly, with full information, knowing what you know about what I have been and what this ranch has been and everything that has been buried in this house. He paused. I am asking you to stay because I want you to stay, not because the ranch needs managing, because I have been watching you for 4 months and I understand now what I have been given, and I do not want to be the kind of man who is given something real and fails to recognize it until it is walking out the door. The kitchen settled around them. The range ticked. The wind moved across the yard in one long, slow pass and was still. Nora looked at this man, difficult in private and slow to speak and slow to feel, a man who had decided to stop and had been gradually, almost involuntarily persuaded back into the world by the simple fact of her being in it, and she thought about what it meant to be chosen, really chosen. Not as the last option or the practical arrangement or the woman who suited because no one better had said yes, but as the specific person, the one in front of him, the one he was looking at. The room at the end of the hallway, she said. He was still. It needs to be cleared, she said. After a long moment, he nodded once. All right, and he said, I'm not saying it to be hard about it, she said. I'm saying it because it's true. What's kept there isn't serving anything. I know, he said. I have known that for some time. He looked at the table. I kept it because letting it go felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. What? He was quiet for a long moment. That I had chosen wrong before. Not in how I felt, I don't mean that, but in what I let her decision mean. I let one person's fear decide what I was capable of. I let that stand for 3 years. And I am admitting now that it was wrong. That it was a waste. He looked at her. That you are not the same kind of thing, and I have treated you as though you might be, and that was unfair. Nora sat with that. She thought about the 9 rejection notices in the cigar box in Abilene. She thought about the train platform, and Abilene getting small behind her in the particular gold of the Kansas light at dawn when she had left it for the last time. She thought about Clara Hess's warning on the train and the choice she had made to come anyway. She thought about the root cellar and the box of letters and the room with the pale blue curtain and the drawing on the shelf. She thought you are not required to stay. You have savings, you have skills, you have more than you came with. You could go, and then she thought, but I don't want to go. This was the thought she had been managing for some time, the thought she had been keeping at a practical distance, not allowing it to become a want, because wanting was the thing that left you open to the specific and familiar pain of not getting. But here it was. She didn't want to go. She wanted to stay in this kitchen and tend this ranch and watch Tommy become a man and help Rex's wife get well and see what the kitchen garden looked like in full summer when she had planted it herself and tended it herself and everything she had put in the ground had come up. She wanted to see if Wade Callister's face in a year's time still had that look of a man who had decided to stop. She did not think it would. I'll need the locked room for storage, she said. Real storage. The pantry overflow. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was in its general direction. I'll clear it, he said, and I want a proper root cellar racking system in the spring. The wooden shelves are half rotted. I'll build it. And I want a kitchen garden twice the size of what's there now. I'll mark it out. She looked at him for a long moment. That's what I need, she said. I know, he said. What else? She thought about it. Nothing else, she said. Not yet. He nodded. Something in his bearing had changed very slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But the weight that had been in him, the particular weight of a man who has been carrying a decision for 3 years and has only now released it, was not quite where it had been. I have been alone for a long time, he said. I am not good at what this requires. I want to be honest about that. I know, she said. I have been alone for a long time too. He looked at her. We'll figure it out, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup from the table. He went to the range and refilled it. He came back and stood by the table. Thank you, he said, for staying when you should have left. I told you on the first night, she said. I came expecting work. He looked at her, that not quite smile again barely there. You got it, he said. I did, she said, and I'm not finished. He left the kitchen. She sat for a while longer with her hands in her lap and the firelight across the floor, and she thought, here is a thing that is real. Here is something I built from nothing, from a cold kitchen in a dying ranch in Montana, from nothing more than the decision to show up and do what needed doing and not leave when it got hard. Here's a thing that is mine, not because it was given to her, because she had stayed for it. You stay down. He cleared the room the following week. He did it alone on a Saturday morning when Silas had taken the other men out to the north pasture for fence work. Nora heard him go in the door, had been repaired, the strike plate reset, the lock oiled, and she heard the sounds of furniture being moved, careful and deliberate, the dragging of the chair, the shifting of the shelf. He carried things out past the kitchen door into the yard, and she watched him from the kitchen window without appearing to watch. The chair went into the barn. The needlework basket went into the barn. The embroidery hoop he held for a moment in the yard, looking at it with the particular focus of a man deciding something, and then he placed it carefully in the basket rather than discarding it, which she thought was the right thing to do, and said something about him that she filed away carefully. The drawing, the small pencil drawing of the house from the eastern slope, he carried back inside, not to the room. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and then above her head in the upper hall, and a drawer opening and closing. That was his to keep. She did not require everything to be undone. He repainted the room on Sunday. White, plain, clean, practical white. She could smell the lime wash through the hallway, and she left the back door open to air it. And by Sunday evening, the room at the end of the hall smelled of fresh paint and nothing else. He did not show her the room when it was done. He left the door open. She walked past it on Sunday evening, on her way to the back door, and she looked in through the open door, and the room was empty and white and entirely nothing yet. No furniture, no smell, no presence. And she stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, here is a room that is ready. She put the pantry overflow shelving in the following week. The cold came back one last time in the second week of April. It arrived without warning, the way the last cold always came. You thought it was over. You had been thinking it was over for 2 weeks. The snow was almost gone, and the mud had come, and the first green was beginning at the south-facing slopes, and then the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the snow came back thick and serious, and the world went white again. Nora was up before the cold finished settling. She had gone to bed knowing it was coming. The quality of the evening air had told her, and the way the horses had been moving in the paddock, restless in particular in the way of animals that can feel weather before humans can. She had built up the range before she went to bed, and she was up an hour before dawn to build it up again. She started the largest pot of soup she had made since November, venison and root vegetables and dried herbs, thick and rich, the kind of thing that could be eaten at any hour of the day or night, and that didn't require sitting down to consume. She made cornbread 3 pans more than usual and put them to bake. She inventoried the pantry against what she knew was still in the cellar and the smokehouse, and she planned what would be needed over the next 2 or 3 days, which was how long she assessed the cold would last. Iron Bell woke up to a blizzard. The next 3 days were the closest thing to an emergency Nora had seen since arriving. It was not catastrophic, not the kind of blizzard that killed stock in numbers, not the total whiteout that made moving between buildings dangerous, but a sustained serious cold snap with 2 feet of new snow and wind enough to make the walks between house and barn and bunkhouse a matter of attention and care. The cattle on the north pasture had to be driven in, and the driving took most of the first day, all 4 men working through weather that turned their faces red and stiff by mid-morning. Nora ran the kitchen like a field operation. She kept the range burning at full capacity continuously for 72 hours. She kept the large pot on the back element, and replenished it every 6 hours. There was always hot food, always coffee, always something that a man coming in from the cold could eat, standing up without needing to take his coat off first. She kept a stack of dry cloths by the back door for wet hands and a rack of socks over the range for the ones that came back soaked through. She sent hot broth out to the bunkhouse twice a day in the covered pot. She gave Silas the second heaviest coat from the hook in the back hall she had found it weeks ago in the closet above the storage room, clearly weighed spare without asking permission. She slept in 2-hour intervals. This was the thing she had prepared for, she understood now. Not just this specific blizzard, but the possibility that the ranch would be tested and that what she had built, the stores, the system, the relationships, the careful preparation of the last 5 months would be what stood between Iron Bell and the alternative. Every jar in the cellar, every smoked cut in the smokehouse, every cord of wood stacked close to the house, every blanket distributed, every gap in the walls stuffed, every piece of preparation she had done through the autumn and winter, without anyone asking her to, simply because it needed doing and she was there and she knew how. It held. On the third evening, when the weather had dropped from emergency to merely difficult, Wade came in from the last of the cattle work. He came in through the back door, and he stood in the kitchen in his coat with snow coming off it, and his face still ruddy from the wind, and he looked at the range going full, and the soup pot, and the coffee, and the rack of drying socks, and the stack of clean cloths, and he looked at Nora standing at the work table with her sleeves rolled, and her hair coming loose, and her hands dusted with the flour she had been using for the fourth batch of cornbread. He didn't say anything for a moment. She put a bowl of soup on the table and a piece of bread beside it without ceremony. He sat down and ate. When he was done, he looked up at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at her across the table, not in that assessing way of the early months, not in the careful, managed way of the winter. Just looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided not to manage himself any further. "Thank you," he said. She knew he did not mean the soup. "This is what I'm here for," she said. "No," he said. "That is not what I am saying." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I have been watching what you did for the last 3 days, what you had ready to do, how far back it went, the preparation, the thought behind it. This has been ready since October, since before the first snow." He looked at her steadily. "You prepared for this ranch as though you intended to be here for all of it, not just the easy part, all of it." "I did intend to be here for all of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." The kitchen was warm around them, and the storm was still working itself out in the dark beyond the windows, diminishing but not yet done. "I want to tell you something I haven't said yet," he said. She waited. "You asked me once why I chose the arrangement, the agency of the listing." He said the last word with the slight discomfort she had come to recognize as his acknowledgement that the word had never sat right with him. "I told you I needed someone to run the household, and I had run out of the interest to do it myself." That was true. It was, she agreed. What I didn't say, what I didn't let myself say, because I had decided I was done with that particular kind of honesty, was that I was also very tired. He looked at his hands. Not tired from work. Tired in the way you get tired when you have been managing everything alone for so long that you stop remembering what it was like to have someone to manage it with. When you stop being able to imagine it, because imagining it requires wanting it, and wanting things had started to feel like a liability. She was very still. "I had Miriam for one summer," he said, "and then I had the idea of her for 3 years, which is worse than having nothing, because an idea doesn't get tired or difficult or inconvenient. It just stays perfect in the place you put it." He looked at her. "You are not an idea." "No," she agreed. "You are the most real thing that has happened to this ranch in a very long time," he said. "And you are the most real thing that has happened to me." He paused. "I wanted you to know that, not as a part of a practical conversation, just to know it." Nora looked at this man. She thought about the morning she had left Abilene, the cigar box full of small envelope rejections, the particular quality of a Kansas dawn when the sky goes gold and you don't know yet whether what you're moving toward is anything. She thought about the train and Clara Hess and the warning she had been given and the choice she had made to come anyway. She thought about 5 months of this kitchen, the bread and the accounts and the blanket and the trading network and the careful daily work of keeping something alive that had decided it was finished. She thought this is what it feels like. Not the fairy tale version, not the thing she had talked herself out of wanting. This. Two people at a kitchen table in a Montana blizzard with soup and cornbread, and 5 months of built trust between them, and a room at the end of the hallway that had been emptied and painted white. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was rough and cold from the weather, big and work-worn, the hand of a man who had spent 30 years building something. He turned it over and held hers. They sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen while the storm outside finished what it was doing. "The garden goes in next week," she said. "I'll double the bed," he said. "Triple it." He looked at her. "Triple," he agreed. Spring came to Iron Bell the way Montana spring always came, with suddenness, as though the land had simply decided it was done with winter and had moved on without consulting anyone. One morning the world was still ice and brown. 2 mornings later, green had appeared in the way. It appeared here, not gradually, but all at once, the announcement of something that had been waiting underground for months and had finally decided to arrive. The kitchen garden went in the last week of April. Nora was out there before first light, most mornings kneeling in the cold mud in her heavy skirt and her worn coat, pressing seeds into the soil she had been preparing since November. Since before the snow had even fully set in, she had been composting and turning and planting. Potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, cabbage in a long double row along the eastern wall where the stone would hold the warmth. Herbs in every sheltered corner. She had expanded the bed by half again, the boundaries marked with the stakes Wade had driven in early spring when the ground first thawed, and she had planted it all with the methodical completeness of a woman who has been waiting for this particular morning for 5 months. The Eastern parcel sale closed the first week of May. She heard it from Wade directly, which was notable. He came to the kitchen at mid-morning when she was midway through a baking run, and he stood in the doorway and said, "The sale is done, the note is settled." She set the bread pan down. "Good," she said. He nodded. He went back to his office. She went back to her bread. That evening at supper, nobody made a speech. Silas poured a second coffee with a deliberateness that said something. Tommy passed the cornbread around a second time without being asked, with the particular quiet energy of a young man who has decided to mark an occasion privately. Rex's jaw was a little less tight than usual, not by much, but by enough. Wade said nothing during supper, which was normal, but he stayed afterward for the first time without the specific excuse of having something to discuss, and he drank his coffee at the kitchen table while Nora washed up, and she thought, this is what the after looks like. The after of the hard part. It does not look like a party. It looks like people who have been through something together sitting in the same room and knowing they are on the other side. She was beginning to understand what the other side looked like. May became June. The kitchen garden was 3 inches high by the second week and climbing. She was out there most evenings after supper, inspecting and tending and thinning where the seeds had come in too thick. There was a particular pleasure in this, in the evidence of something doing exactly what she had put it in the ground to do, that she found she could not quite adequately describe to herself except to call it the pleasure of having bet right. She had been betting right a lot lately. The trading arrangement had expanded in the spring. There were now 6 families who participated in an informal rotation that Bess Harmon had organized with the practical efficiency of a woman who understood commerce. Nora's preserved goods went out and staple supplies came back, and the kitchen at Iron Bell Ranch was stocked better than it had been in years. She had started a separate account for the income, small but real and growing, and she kept it in the kitchen notebook alongside everything else, a running total of what the kitchen had generated on its own, independent of the ranch's main finances. She mentioned it to Wade in June. He looked at her over the desk she had taken to sitting in the chair across from him on Sunday evenings when she brought the household accounts for his review, and he said, "That's yours." "It belongs to the kitchen," she said. "Then it belongs to both of us," he said. "You built it. It's yours." She filed this in the same place she filed everything important, deep and careful. He had been different since March. Not dramatically, he was still Wade Callister. Still quiet, still economical, with both words and demonstrations, still the kind of man who expressed things in what he did rather than in what he said. But the quality of the silence had changed. The managed blankness she had encountered in November, the particular closed stillness of a man who has decided not to let anything in or out, was no longer the default. He was present in a way he had not been before. He lingered at supper. He asked Silas questions. He told Tommy something one evening about his own boyhood in the Eastern Territories, that made Tommy put down his fork and listen with his whole body, the attentiveness of a young man receiving something he has not had enough of. He came to the kitchen. This was still several months into its being normal, the thing she noticed most. He came to the kitchen in the evenings, and he sat at the table, and she worked around him, and they talked sometimes and were silent, other times, and the silence was the silence of two people who are comfortable in the same room, which is an entirely different thing from the silence of a man managing his distance and a woman respecting it. One Sunday evening in late June, he sat across from her while she finished the kitchen accounts, and she felt him watching her, not the assessing watch of the early months, but something quieter and more habitual, the kind of watching that doesn't require anything in return. "Do you regret it?" he said. She looked up. "Regret what?" "Coming here." He looked at his coffee cup. "Knowing everything you know now." She considered that honestly the way she considered everything. "No," she said, "not even the first 3 months. Especially not the first 3 months," she said. "I needed to know what I was dealing with. And then I knew. And that was better." He looked at her. "I came here because I had nowhere else to be," she said. "And then I found out I had somewhere to be, which is better than most people get." He was quiet for a moment. "What I found," and he said, "when I came to the kitchen that night in December and you were asleep at the table, I stood there for a while." "I know," she said. "I found the blanket. I stood there and I thought—" He stopped, looked for the words with the effortful care of a man who doesn't use them easily and knows it. "I thought this is what I forgot. This is what it feels like when someone decides a place is worth caring for. When someone looks at something that has been let go and decides it isn't done yet." He looked at her. "I didn't want to forget that again." She sat with that for a moment. "You said something like that in March," she said. "I meant it in December," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it yet." She nodded. She went back to her accounts. He drank his coffee. Outside, the June evening was long and gold, the Montana sky holding its light past 9 in the way that summer evenings here held it, as though the day was reluctant to end. The ranch was quiet. The animals settled the men in the bunkhouse, the kitchen garden, showing in the fading light the full abundance of what she had planted. "She thought I put those in the ground. Every seed, every row, everything. I put it in the ground in the cold, in the doubt, in the not yet spring, on the bet that spring would come and that I would be here to see it." She was here. The bet had paid. Silas found her alone in the kitchen on a morning in July when Wade had gone to Garnet and the hands were on the pasture, and he sat down without ceremony and said what he had been working up to saying. She had known he had been working up to it for some time. "I want you to know something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his hands, the hands of an old man who had worked hard for 30 years and had the evidence of it in every line and callus. 3 years ago, after Miriam left, he said, "Batum, Mr. Callister signed papers selling this ranch." She was very still. "He signed them and I tore them up," Silas said. "Or rather, I talked him into withdrawing, not with any particular argument. Just don't. Just wait and see. Because I have known that man since before he built this place, and I knew that whatever he was in those months was not who he is." He looked at her. "He withdrew the papers, but he didn't come back. He just stopped, kept the land, didn't sell it, didn't save it either. Just held on. I don't know why. Pride maybe, or the part of him that was still him underneath." She thought about the fence he had repaired on the coldest day of January. The particular stubbornness of a man who still responded to what needed doing even when he had decided he was done. "You stayed through it," she said. "I stayed because he stayed," Silas said, "even when what he was doing wasn't much better than leaving." He paused. "And then you came." She waited. "I have been watching him for 30 years, Silas said. "I know what he looks like when he is present, and I know what he looks like when he is somewhere else. For 3 years he was somewhere else. Since about November he has been here." He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know what you did." She looked at him for a long moment. "We all did it together," she said. "You and Rex and Tommy and all of it." "Yes," he said. "But you were the reason we all had something to do it toward." He stood, put on his hat, and left. She stood at the work table for a long time after that in the July morning with the kitchen window open and the warm air coming in and the sound of the garden in the wind, the growing things moving, and the smell of sun-warm earth, and everything that was alive and present in hers. She thought 15 words. That is what Silas said that matters. You were the reason we all had something to do it toward. She thought about being chosen last. She thought about the cigar box. She thought about Clara Hess. She thought about every night she had spent in the narrow bedroom off the kitchen, listening to the Montana wind and thinking, well, you are here. You have nowhere else to be. You might as well be here entirely. She thought last did not mean what I believed it meant. It did not mean least or final or insufficient. It meant the one who stayed when the others didn't. The one who showed up with no guarantee and no soft option and decided in the cold kitchen of a failing ranch in a territory she had never seen that this was where she was going to be. She had held this place together. The place had held her back. That was everything. That was more than she had ever been promised. In August, Wade hired a fourth hand, a young man named Elias recommended by Rex's wife's family, who arrived with good references and a willingness to learn that immediately appealed to Tommy, who had by now taken on something very close to a senior role at the ranch, despite having never been formally given one. Nora watched Tommy take Elias through the morning routine on the first day with the focused authority of someone who finally knows what he's doing, and she felt something she could only call satisfaction of the deep and private kind that doesn't require anyone else to acknowledge it. The herd was growing again. Slowly, carefully, the way you rebuilt something when you understood what losing it had cost. Wade was deliberate about it in a way he had not been in the years before she could see the difference in how he talked about the cattle, how he talked about the land, how he talked about the future with specificity, with plans that extended past the next season, with the quality of investment of a man who has come back to caring about the outcome. He had started talking about the apple trees. He had mentioned them first in passing in late June and then again in July, with more specificity, and by August he had drawn a rough plan of where they would go, 8 of them, along the south wall of the kitchen garden, where the stone would hold the warmth. He had calculated the years to bearing. He was thinking in years. She thought that is how you know a person has decided to be somewhere, when they think in years. One evening in late August, she came in from the garden in the long gold light of an end-of-summer day, carrying a basket of late-season vegetables, the last of the summer, squash, the first of the hard cabbage, a handful of the herbs she had grown along the east wall that she would dry and use through the winter. She set the basket on the work table and turned to wash her hands, and she found him in the kitchen doorway. He had been watching her come across the yard. She could tell from the particular quality of his stillness, not the old managed stillness of a man keeping his distance, but the stillness of a man who has stopped trying to pretend he wasn't watching. "You have dirt on your face," he said. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "Better toi." "No," he said, "but it doesn't matter." He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, close the way he had stood the first time she had tried to leave close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the silver in his hair, and the particular set of his jaw that she had learned over 9 months meant he had decided to say something and was saying it. He reached out unhurried, without ceremony, and took her rough flour and soil-dusted hand in his. His hands were rough too, decades of work in them, the same work she had been doing here, the same specific kind of labor that built something over time. She looked at their hands together and thought, these are the hands of 2 people who know how to hold things together when they are coming apart. These are the hands of 2 people who kept faith with a place that had stopped keeping faith with itself. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood in the kitchen in the late August light, the evening coming gold through the windows and across the floor, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the not saying was complete. "The apple trees go in this fall," she said. "Before the first frost," he said. 8 trees. 8. She looked at him. "Better next year," she said. He looked at her with the not-quite smile that was. She had come to understand the fullest version of a smile this man produced, which was fine, which was more than sufficient, which was exactly what she had always needed. "Better every year," he said. She believed him. September came to Iron Bell the way September always came to Montana, the light going gold and longer shadowed the mountains wearing their first new white. On the high peaks, the air carrying that particular quality of cold and clarity that announced the season changing in the way that season changes here, not with apology, not with transition, but with authority. The kitchen garden was in its final abundant weeks before frost. She was out there most mornings harvesting and storing and planning what would be preserved and what would be left to go to seed for next year. The cabbages were excellent, better than she had hoped. The onions had done very well. The potatoes were good and plentiful. The herbs had spread along the east wall in a way she had not planned but had no objection to. Rex's wife had come to the ranch in August with their boy to stay a few days before the cold set in. Adeline was better. The chest trouble had eased through the summer and the color was back in her face, and she had walked through the kitchen garden with Nora on a warm August afternoon and asked about every plant by name with the focused interest of a woman who was thinking about planting her own. Her boy had run in the yard and been thoroughly frightened by one of the chickens, and Tommy had spent 20 minutes showing him how to hold grain in his palm so the chicken would come to him rather than the other way around, with the patient instruction of someone who had learned to do things without being afraid of them. Silas was planning to stay the winter. He had not said so explicitly. He had simply in September added a new set of pegs to the bunkhouse wall for his coat and his hat. That was enough. Tommy had received a letter from a woman in Garnet. He had not mentioned it at supper, but she had seen his face when he came back from the post office in town, and she had put an extra biscuit on his plate on Sunday without comment. Iron Bell Ranch was not prosperous. Not yet. The eastern section was sold, and the herd was a fraction of what it had been at its height, and there were debts yet to pay and lean months still ahead. These were real losses, and they would take real time. But the kitchen was full. The books were balanced. The smokehouse had meat in it for the winter. The root cellar had been restocked with the proper racking system Wade had built in May. The kitchen garden was going into its last good weeks, and the 8 young apple trees planted along the south wall before the first frost stood in their careful row, bare-limbed and patient, waiting for spring. On a morning in the first week of September, Nora was at the garden edge with her basket when she heard the back door, and she turned around. Wade was crossing the yard toward her with 2 cups of coffee, moving through the gold September light with the unhurried deliberateness that was entirely his, wearing his work clothes, squinting slightly against the morning sun the way he always did. He held out one of the cups. She set down her basket and took it. They stood together in the kitchen garden in the September morning and drank coffee and looked at what she had grown, what they had kept, what they had built from the cold shell of what had nearly been lost. "Good year," he said. "Better next year," she said. He looked at her with the not quite smile, the real one, the one that meant something. "Better next year," he agreed. The horses moved in the paddock. From the bunkhouse, she could hear the start of the morning Silas's voice. Tommy's answer, the sound of boots on the step. Elias was out early. She could see him at the fence. Rex was walking from the barn toward the north pasture in the slanting light. Iron Bell was moving, working alive in the particular way of a place that has decided it has reason to be. She had held this place together when it was falling apart. She had stretched nothing into something and kept 4 men fed and kept the fires going and built a small economy from a pantry and a smokehouse and a notebook on a nail. She had done all of it without anyone asking her to, simply because it needed doing, and she was there, and she knew how. She had found a box of letters in a root cellar and a locked room at the end of a hallway, and she had decided that what was buried there was not her business, except insofar as it explained what was in front of her, and she had been right about that. She had been chosen last. She had decided a long time ago now that last did not mean what she had always believed it meant. The September light came over the mountains and across the garden and across the yard and across the kitchen wall, where she intended to hang a sign. She had been thinking about it for weeks. The words and the placement, the particular piece of pine board she had seen in the barn that would do nicely for it, and she thought, "I found it." Not the thing she had talked herself out of hoping for young, when she had still imagined a different kind of story for herself. Not the easy version, the version that arrived without cost, the version that didn't require you to board a train to a territory you had never seen, on the basis of a practical notice from a placement agency and a sprig of dried sage you couldn't name the reason for. Something better. Something that had been earned day by day, jar by jar, winter by winter, in the precise and patient way that real things are always earned, by showing up, by staying, by deciding that a place and a person were worth the full weight of your effort, even when no one had asked you to give it, and even when you weren't sure that the effort would be returned. It had been returned. She had held this place, and this place had held her back. That was everything. That was more than she had ever been promised. And if this story touched you, if you have ever felt like the last choice or the wrong kind, or wondered whether what you carry and what you know and what you are willing to do is enough, I want you to know this channel is for you. Leave a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. Every single comment means the world to me. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button before this video ends. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We are here every single week with new stories of women like Nora Callahan, plain practical, unhurried, and worth every word. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.